Hey guys, welcome to chapter 14.4. This is the last section in chapter 14, so super exciting. So let's get started. So one of the things that we talked about was how Mendelian patterns of inheritance was clearly seen, obviously in pea plants, because they were much simpler to study. And then we even could relate them to animals, to humans, the things that we saw. And we'll continue to see them in, other parts of genetics. Even though Mendelian's theories were very simple, they can be related to more complex things. But when it comes to humans, even though we can see how traits are inherited and contributed through plants and animals, it's kind of hard to do that in humans. We are not a very good subjects to be kind of tested with when it comes to genetics. And the reason is that, one, our generation time is too long. We don't produce many offspring at once. Usually, we can only produce one, sometimes two, sometimes three, sometimes a couple more offspring at one time. And even then, it takes, 9 months. And obviously, we can't just breed people together. It's inhumane, not right. But we can still apply some of Mendelian's genetics to some of the things that we know about human genetics through years of research. So one of the ways that we can actually analyze how traits are being passed down and how they're passed down is through something called a pedigree. And a pedigree is basically a family tree, and that is going to kind of tell you how the relationships of parents and children across generations can be seen clearly through this tree, and how certain traits get passed down. And you can kind of see like who's the carrier, who has the actual trait to carry whatever, if it's a disease, or even if it's, like blue eyes or being albino. And you can trace these down using this pedigree. So this is an example of a pedigree. You can see that there is a key on the bottom right-hand corner, and you can see that anything that looks just pure white, whether it's a square or a circle, is unknown. Or unaffected, I'm sorry. So they're not affected by whatever trait that we're trying to look for. Those that are colored in black are affected, so they do show symptoms of this trait that we're studying. And those that kind of have the lines running through are a carrier. So they may be a carrier, but they're not showing the actual symptoms. And then the ones with the questions, we don't know. So this is kind of how a pedigree works. So you can kind of see, for example, when you start off at number 1 and 2, they're mating together. And then you can see how the sibling or the offspring that 1 and 2 produce are number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6, because they have direct links associated with number 1 and 2. And you can see that out of those 4 offspring that they produce, only number 4 actually has the trait, or is actually showing symptoms for the trait. 2 of the out of the 4 are carriers for it, and then 1 of them has nothing. So you can learn a lot from pedigrees. You can also use pedigrees to make predictions about what a future offspring would have. So you can actually predict whether they can be a carrier, they can actually have this trait, or may not. And this is where the multiplication and addition rule comes in to help predict the specific phenotypes of these offspring. So you can either see what are the chances that they're going to have it, multiply it, or add it together. So there are disorders that are recessive, meaning that the only way that you can actually show to have this specific disorder is if you carry both recessive alleles. And recessive disorders sometimes can be very mild, that you might not even know you have it, honestly. And then there are some severe cases where it's pretty life-threatening and very serious. interesting though, like I said before, is that the recessive inherited disorders are only going to show up in an individual if they're homozygous for the allele. So that means it's like little a, little b, little b. But the carriers are going to be heterozygous, which means that you're going to have big A, little a, or big B, little b. They're not going to be the same alleles. Depending on that, if this disorder is recessive, obviously if you have big A, little a, you're not going to be showing for that disorder, but you are a carrier for it because you have that little a. The way that an individual usually gets the recessive disorder is because the parents are carriers for it. So mom and dad can be big A, little a, big A, little a, or dad is big A, little a, mom is big A, little a, or so on and so forth. An example of this is albinism, which is a recessive condition. And albinism, you've probably seen that whether in people or even in animals. One of my friends last week posted that she saw an albino deer in her backyard, which is really cool. But it's basically you are lacking the pigmentation in your skin and in your hair, and that's why you have that white, bright color. Okay, so let's talk about albinism. So if I say that the parents, for example, if this is the egg and this is a sperm, okay, so the egg is going to be big A, little a, and it's going to be crossed or fertilized by a sperm that is also big A, little a. So let's use a Punnett square and see what are the chances that the offspring of these two individuals, the parents, are going to have an albino child. So for the sperm, I'm going to put big A, little a, and then for the egg, I'm going to do the same, and I'm going to cross them. So from the cross, we can distinguish which of these are definitely not going to be a carrier or have the trait at all, or which one is going to be affected. So you can see that for big A, they are not going to either be a carrier and they're not going to have the disorder at all. But for big A, little a, which is 50% of the 4 offspring, you can tell that they are going to be a carrier for this disorder because they have that little a. Even though that little a is not showing, they're still carrying it. And then you have finally little a, which means that this offspring would in fact show to have albinism. Remember, because albinism is a recessive disorder, the only way you can have albinism is if you have a homozygous alleles for it. So you have little a, little a. Okay. Now, if a recessive allele that causes a disease is rare, it's going to be pretty unlikely that you have 2 carriers that are going to meet and that they're going to mate. It's just how it works. I mean, it's not impossible, but it is very rare for that to happen. Now, there are matings that can happen that you've probably seen in different cultures, which, it's also, a taboo or it's against the law. And basically, it's when you have mating between pretty close relatives like cousins, hopefully not siblings, but, sometimes first cousins do sometimes, they do get together and they produce offspring. And that can be pretty dangerous because of, the genetic disorders that can come with that. And that also will increase the chance that, you could have both parents that are carrying the same rare allele that could produce this kind of disorder, recessive disorder to occur in them. Okay, so you've probably heard of cystic fibrosis, which is a very common genetic disease, which sadly is fatal and ends up being fatal. And in United States, in America, you have a lot of cases. Actually, there's actually one in about every 2,500 people that do get affected with this. It might not seem a lot, but honestly, if you just think about your town, there are a couple of people, a good handful of people that are affected by it because it's, 2,500 people is not that many. When you look at the comparison with how many people can be located in just a town. And basically, cystic fibrosis allele causes it's pretty much a defect or absent in a chloride transport channel in the plasma membrane of your cells. And so because of this defect in the chloride channel, this leads to a lot of chloride ions that build up outside of the cell. And because of this buildup, you can have a lot of symptoms like mucus buildups in internal organs. You can have, improper absorption of nutrients in the small intestine, and that can cause some serious issues to the body as a whole. There's also another disease called sickle cell disease, which is also a genetic disorder. And it's actually more common in the African American descent. Why? I'm not honestly 100% sure, but it is not unlikely to see them in any other cultures, or descents. There are people who I know that are Caucasian, that are Indian, that have this disease. So it's just more common in African Americans, but that doesn't mean you should cancel out seeing this disease in other ethnicities. And basically what happens is it's kind of crazy that, if you remember, we studied the amino acids, which pretty much make up the proteins that are in your body. And just one single substitution of an amino acid in the hemoglobin protein, which is in your red blood cells, can cause sickle cell disease. And it's in homozygous individuals, and pretty much it causes all of your hemoglobin to be abnormal, which causes the sickle cell shape. And this is really dangerous because you have a lot of physical weakness. People usually can't do a lot of exercise and activities. That's why you hear about a lot of athletes who might not even know about sickle cell disease, who are very, strenuous in their exercise, and they end up just dying while running or something because they just they can't get oxygen to the rest of their body very fast enough, or their blood cells clog and stuff like that. But you also have a lot of pain, you have organ damage, and you can also have paralysis, which is kind of really scary if you think about it. So this is what it kind of looks like. Or it is what it looks like, honestly. So here you have your regular blood cell, you have your normal red blood cell tissues, cells. They're nice and round, they're easily able to move through your blood vessels. And then you have a sickle cell, which looks kind of like a half moon. And what happens is they easily clog blood vessels. They're not able to move swiftly through your blood vessels, and that can cause, clogging in your arteries, in your blood vessels. You're not getting blood to the rest of your body. You're not able to move oxygen throughout the rest of your body. And that's why people get sick very easily and fast. So it's interesting because we said how sickle cell disease is a, homozygous trait or disorder. People who are heterozygous, though, don't actually show any symptoms for it. They're pretty healthy. They can go about their life normally. So they're just a carrier for it. And it's kind of crazy to think that 1 out of 10 African Americans actually have this sickle cell trait. And it's very interesting to see why is it so high? It's very unusually high. 1 in 10 compared to cystic fibrosis, which is still a lot, I think, to have 1 in 2,500 to have them, but 1 in 10 African Americans get these. That's pretty crazy. But the interesting thing is those who are heterozygous for the sickle cell disease actually are less susceptible to malaria parasite, which means that they kind of have the superpower that they cannot get, or less common to get, malaria in regions where there is a high case of malaria, which is from mosquitoes. So they kind of have this immunity, not completely, but are more immune to malaria than other people who are not heterozygous for it. So very interesting. Okay, dominantly inherited disorders. So some disorders, like we said, are recessively inherited and some are dominant. And this dominant alleles can cause pretty fatal diseases, even though they are rare, and they usually come because of some kind of mutation. There is something called achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism that you can see that is pretty rare, but it is caused by a dominant allele. So usually, like I said, this is inherited. And there's also another disease called Huntington's disease, which is really sad, honestly, if you see it. I know some of my friends who have relatives who do have Huntington's disease. It is genetic. And so basically, it's a degenerative disease of your nervous system. It pretty much causes you to have kind of random mood swings. You can get angry really fast. You can get, sad. You can't really control your emotions. Your memory goes down. Your control of your body goes down. And, I know people personally who are in their 20s who are already in nursing homes because they have this disease and they are losing control of their body. This disease does not have any phenotype effects, so physical effects that you can actually see in the individual until about their 35 to 40 years of age. And once they start to deteriorate, so once they actually, the disease starts to progress, it does become irreversible and fatal, which is really, really sad. I do have a friend, who has lost a parent because of this when they were about 40 years old, and now her siblings have it, and thankfully she doesn't, but it's such a hard process to digest and watch your relatives suffer through. Now there are some disorders that are multifactorial. So many diseases like heart disease, cancer, alcoholism, mental illnesses, they can have genetic and environmental components, So even though, someone might have parents who were alcoholics, does not mean that you will be an alcoholic. But if you are in an environment where your friends are constantly drinking, your family's constantly drinking, you're always at the bar to hang out, maybe you have one or two sips, you could be more prone to that because of your environment. And same thing with cancer, there could be people who have parents who have cancer and their children have nothing, but their grandchildren do, or, you might have no one in your family who has cancer and all of a sudden you do. So it's very different in how these things progress. And like I said, your lifestyle does have a huge effect on your phenotype. So, for example, you could have a family that has cardiovascular disease, but you are very healthy in the way you exercise, you take care of yourself, you make, very regular doctor checkups, you're taking your blood tests to make sure everything's under control, you're eating healthy, you're living a healthy lifestyle, you are not going to be as prone to that cardiovascular disease, that may run in your family as much as somebody who might not have any cardiovascular disease in their family, but they are not taking care of themselves as well. So it depends. Now, there are genetic testing and counseling that you can have, the genetic counselors are pretty awesome people who help you to kind of understand what are the chances that maybe your child could have a certain disease, or what are the risk factors, basically by studying your family history for a specific disease. So for example, if you have a couple that has a brother who died from the same recessively inherited disease, a genetic counselor, they can actually determine what are the chances that that couple's child is going to have that particular disease that their brother passed from. Now, it's important that, each child, you have to incorporate genetic variation. So each child has so many genes that can get recycled. And so they're not going to be the same. They can be, even though, they could have two children, they can have completely different traits that they're carrying in their genes because of how much variation there is. And so, they could be unaffected or affected. Now, if both of the members of the couple had a sibling with the recessively inherited illness, that means both of their parents were carriers. Okay, so that means that each of the couple has a 2 out of 3 chance of being a carrier, right? Now, if both of the carriers, if both of the parents are carriers, they have a fourth of a chance of their child having that recessive illness. So think back to how I did the Punnett square for the albinism. Only 1 out of the 4 squares showed to be albino, right? Same thing. This is a recessive disorder. Same thing like the albinism. So if you did the Punnett square, you would see that only 25% of their offspring would have this chance of carrying that recessive disease, because 1 out of the 4 squares would carry that recessive homozygous alleles. So if you use the multiplication rule, you would just multiply 2/3 for mom, 2/3 for dad, times 1/4 chance of the child having it, and you would get 1/9 probability. For the growing number of diseases that we do have a lot of tests that are available to see if you are carriers and to kind of define the odds more accurately to see how likely it is that your child could have the disease. And the tests that are available kind of just help people understand, how much do I have to be prepared? What are the chances? What can I expect? Now, there are other issues, like whether the affected individuals fully understand what their genetic tests actually mean and how these tests are used. Some people, can kind of take it the wrong way and say, oh, if I'm going to have these chances of, my child having even a small percentage of this thing, I'm not going to even try, and it's kind of sad because you never know. You never know what, because like I said, there's just so much variation that goes into one child. So these genetic tests are kind of more of a, hey, just be cautious that this could happen, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. Now, there are ways that you can test your baby while still in the womb to see if they have or show any of these symptoms. So there's one where it's called amniocentesis, where basically you are testing the liquid that the fetus is pretty much like floating in. And what you do is you remove that liquid while still in the womb of the mom, and you test it. There's also something called chronic villus sapling, which is also CVS. And this is a sample of the placenta of the baby that is removed and then tested for disorders or whatever you're, concerned about. And then you can also have ultrasound that can be assessed. And you can, through that, you can study the health of the baby, like their heart rate and stuff like that, even while the baby is still in your in the fetus and still in the belly of the woman. There are some genetic disorders that can be tested as soon as the baby is birthed. That is just routine checks that a lot of hospitals do. And then one of the most common is called PKU, which is basically a recessive disorder that occurs every 10,000 to 15,000 births in the U.S. So this is it for our chapter 14. Please make sure that you take good notes on it, send them to me, and I hope you enjoyed it.